Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Jillian Bender-Cormier. I'm brand manager with Bender Insurance Solutions. We want to welcome you to another engaging BenderU webinar on COVID-19, construction fraud, and workers' compensation fraud. Some housekeeping notes. Throughout this webinar, our moderator, Lisa Bracero, will be fielding questions from you, our listeners, and making the webinar a more interactive experience. At the end of this webinar, we will also have an additional dedicated Q&A time. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the chat box or in the Q&A section. We want to be conscious of time, so if we don't get to answer all of your questions, we will gladly reach out to you individually after the webinar. You are all in listen-only mode and will remain muted throughout the webinar. This session is being recorded, and at the conclusion of the webinar, both the recording link and a copy of the presentation will be forwarded to you. We have a fantastic set of experts sharing with us this morning. I'll allow Bender's own Lisa Bracero, who will be serving as moderator, to kick off the discussion. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and welcome to all of our attendees. We're grateful to have you join with us this morning to hear some of the important things that you can do as an organization to support the long-term profitability and viability through reduced risk of fraud. But before we get started with the conversation on fraud, because there is a lot of moving pieces with respect to COVID-19 and workers' compensation, I wanted to make sure that these are all on your radar. As you're probably aware by now, last month, the WCIRB, which is California's rating and statistical organization for workers' comp, submitted some special rules to the insurance commissioner. The rules are pending the review and approval by the commissioner, but the deadline for public feedback as well as for their public hearing was this past Monday, May the 18th. In a webinar hosted by the WCIRB yesterday, they shared that Ricardo Lara, our insurance commissioner, expressed public support for the direction of the rules, and it is anticipated that these rules or a variation of them would be approved. They also had support by employer groups that were in attendance. So what are these rules that we are talking about? Really, it's recognizing the statewide impact of COVID-19 from a pandemic side, but also from a response perspective, and how do we properly give credit to businesses for the fact that their employees, if they are on a paid leave, aren't generating a workers' comp exposure of any regular significance. And so if they have employees on paid leave, whether that's the FMLA-related leave, Families First Coronavirus Act, if they are sick, if their family members are sick or they're quarantining, the idea is that this payroll would still be reported to your workers' compensation carrier, but if you are able to provide documentation showing that they are not working, you would not have to pay workers' comp rates on that. So you want to make sure you're keeping those records, and that would be effective if approved from the stay-at-home order date through up to 30 days after the order is lifted, as well as if you have employees who maybe were working in a retail capacity, construction field capacity, something that is a higher risk, obviously, than clerical, if you are able to reassign them on a one-time basis to a more administrative role, because that is the work available to them, maybe they're doing that from home, maybe they're doing it in the office, their payroll could be reassigned one time to this lower rate class of 8810. So again, keep records of the assignments that you are giving to your staff. Another benefit, which is especially important since there is now a workers' compensation rebuttal presumption for COVID claims, is they're proposing that claims for workers' comp that have a primary diagnosis of COVID-19 not be counted in an employer's experience modification. And I think that is super important. It's recognizing that While a company can do many things to keep their employees safe, in a pandemic situation, it is highly challenging for an organization to manage that. And with a rebuttal presumption, it's, I think, really making it more fair, if you will, for the employers. So these are proposed rule changes, and they would be retroactive, even if they don't get approved until, say, July the 1st. So keep your records there. Have a conversation with us if you have questions as to how your organization could benefit or be impacted by those. And so that's really what I'm talking about here. Track your employees, track your payroll, their assignments, monitor your claims coding if you should have any that are COVID-19 specific. And then regarding that rebuttal presumption, that if an employee, maybe one of your construction workers, maybe a restaurant or grocery store employee, if they have COVID-19 and they tell you about this, you're going to want to select their claim form and get that turned into your broker insurer right away, because there's only 30 days to be able to rebut the presumption that they contracted it through work. So it requires a lot of diligence on the part of all of our organizations and insurers. So just wanted to give you that quick update because it's all moving quickly. But we are super excited to have with us this morning Clint Herndon. He is the president of Next Peak CPA, and he's going to be talking about slippery schemes and fraud in the construction industry. I had the pleasure of meeting Clint at the CFMA regional conference in Truckee last fall, where he spoke on construction and fraud to the attendees there. He has a great perspective as a CPA by trade, and with that also having law enforcement background, both as a boots on the ground police officer, as well as a certified fraud examiner, and working with law enforcement, including the California Department of Insurance. So he has both a technical background and a real world background that I think makes him very interesting, engaging, and can provide you with a lot of tactical recommendations so that you can protect your business and its profitability. He is also the host, I learned recently, of Next Peak podcast. So if you enjoy listening to podcasts while you drive, while you go for walks, his is focused on life and being passion for life and goals and achievement. And it's not double entry accounting. So I promise you, it's quite engaging. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Clint. Clint, please lead the way.
Hey, thanks, Lisa. Can everybody hear me okay? Hopefully. Lisa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Hey guys, welcome, and thank you, Bender, for having me. What an honor it is to come and present. This is a little bit of a foreign territory for me. I don't do a lot of online presentations, so forgive me if I laugh at my own jokes because I'm used to talking to an audience and seeing some feedback. But thank you for the introduction. And yes, the Next Peak podcast, don't worry, it won't put you to sleep. We don't sit around and talk about accounting. That would be far too boring. But all right, diving right in. Hey, I have the privilege of being here today. And what I want to share, what I want you to walk away with today is the how and why of fraud in the construction industry. So the concept of fraud really hasn't changed over the years. It's really just the vehicle by which it's carried out. And so I'm going to talk about how it's carried out in the current state of the world. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on with the COVID situation and the trends that are arising out of that. And but most importantly, at least from my perspective, is I want to talk about the why fraud occurs. So with that, I'm going to dive right into a story. Now, like Lisa touched on, I was a police officer with the City of Roseville for 7 years. 3 of those, I'm sorry, were in financial and computer crimes. And then I went on to work for the Department of Insurance, where I was an investigator, and then the sergeant in charge of field training for the state. So some of the stories I'm going to share are either personal investigations that I was a part of, or something that one of my teams or my partners had worked. So going back to my Roseville days, we'll go into a construction company. So Mark, not a real name, but Mark was the owner of a construction company. Mark came to us and said, I don't know what's going on. Something's not right. I seem to be missing some money from my books. But it can't be, because Sue is my trusted office manager. She's a family friend. She has just been everything to the organization. I've been able, Mark's telling us, I've been able to be out making money, building projects, running crews, knowing that Sue was back in the office just taking care of all that money stuff. So if you're listening and a little alarm is going off, it should be, right? Sue's in charge of all that money stuff, and Mark trusted her completely. So I'll get into some of the schemes that Sue had actually used. This is a real case that I investigated. Again, I changed the names to protect the non-innocent and the innocent, but we'll get into exactly how she did that. But I want to frame that for you, because what happened is we went in there, she had wiped the hard drive clean, but we were still able to figure out that she had taken about $200,000 over the course of a little over 24 months. So a significant amount of money from a local construction company. When we dig into how something happens, I always like to go back to why, whether that's a good action that we take, or a crime or a bad action that we take. There's always a why behind what we do. And I'm a certified fraud examiner through the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and can't recommend that organization enough for fraud resources. And if you have people in accounting or internal controls, I would highly recommend that they go through some of the courses and maybe even consider the certification. But the ACFE, one of the things that they always talk about, and I love getting back to, is the fraud triangle. Excuse me. So 1973, criminologist Donald Cressy was trying to explain why fraud and crime occurs, so that we could have a better understanding of the ingredients that go into it. And what he came to the conclusion of is that most of the time there are three ingredients present in a fraud. And the first one is pressure. So pressure being anything outside, such as a sick relative, a kid going to college, a car broke down, maybe as an employee, I'm watching my coworker make more money than I am. So there's some pressure, right? We've got some type of financial pressure on us. Excuse me. After talking about COVID, I'm definitely afraid to cough on the microphone. And it's just hay fever, I promise. So pressure, but pressure by itself is not enough. There has to be an opportunity. What I mean by opportunity is if I'm in a position where I have access to resources, and that access is either unrestricted or not reviewed as well as it should be. So I've got the pressure of some financial strain on me. I've got an opportunity to take money, but those in themselves are usually not enough. And that's because we as human beings have an innate sense of right and wrong. And that can be, if you look at a kid, who knows when they've been caught sticking their hand in the cookie jar, right? We know when we've done something wrong. And most of us, even though we have pressures of life, we all have pressures in life. Some of us have an opportunity or access to resources. We all do, actually. We all have access to company pens and, computer products and printer paper and all those things. Most of the time, our sense of right and wrong is going to mitigate the action. It's going to stop us from taking that. So the piece that he said that is also present is this rationalization. So we've got to rationalize why we're going to commit a crime or cross the boundary into wrong from right. And that rationalization could be as simple as, well, the company doesn't pay me enough money, and so I'm just getting what's rightly mine. That's usually not enough. Usually it's the one that I always heard when I was interviewing suspects was, well, I was just going to borrow the money, right? It was never, in their mind, they were never stealing, they were never taking the money. They were always going to repay the money, even though, logically that was never going to happen. And they borrowed, and then they borrowed, and then they borrowed. And pretty soon they had borrowed so much money that it became noticeable. And then the victims would call the police department. So we're going to dive into 4 major categories of fraud that we're seeing currently and how it's being carried out. The most common is asset misappropriation. That's probably the most common that all of us think about. That's employees stealing. That's if you have a construction site, that could be somebody external to the organization that shows up and takes supplies or metals. And we refer to that as shrinkage, inventory shrinkage, that type of thing. Or it could be as simple as like the petty cash fund going missing. But those are very common, but they're the least costly. And if you think about what is typically stolen, it typically is office supplies and those types of things, or the petty cash fund. It's not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now that's not always true, but that's kind of the most common theft. Corruption, on the other hand, is the most costly, and it's actually the most prevalent in all global regions. And we'll dig into what corruption exactly is. It sounds really cool, and we've probably seen headlines about it. But what exactly is corruption? But the interesting part of that is, I think here in the United States, we hear corruption and bribes and these behind the scenes deals being done, and we think of like Eastern Bloc countries or South America or Africa or these different places where that's the way business is done. But the truth is, it's still extremely prevalent here in North America, in the United States, and in Canada. And so it is something that we have to pay attention to. And it might surprise you some of the things that are actually corruption, whether they're illegal or not, they might be immoral. The other facts to me that are interesting is that only 4% of perpetrators had a prior criminal record. And I think a lot of us would be surprised by that on the surface until we dig into it. Right? We hear, oh, well, gosh, Sue, like the office manager example I gave, Sue was a trusted family friend, so she didn't have a prior criminal record. But if you think about it a little bit deeper, we don't hire people we don't trust, right? We don't hire people we don't trust. So flip side of that is we hire people we trust. If you're in a job interview and you have a spidey sense that this person is not a good person, that they've got some questionable morals or ethics, maybe even a questionable background, you're probably not extending them a job offer, right? Unless there's some reason that you would. You wouldn't if so you're hiring people that you trust. You wouldn't offer a job to somebody that came into you and said, hey, thanks for interviewing me today. Just want to let you know, the day I come in to work for you, I'm going to start stealing stuff from you, right? We wouldn't do that. So it really isn't a surprise that the people who are carrying these out are not career criminals, or at least they haven't been caught as career criminals. They may have committed similar offenses before. And the internal controls that we have in place, and we're going to talk about that at the end, but the internal controls are extremely important in catching frauds and preventing that. If we go back to the opportunity piece, The internal controls are going to help eliminate that opportunity. So just because somebody has pressures in life, and they might even be able to rationalize why they would take money, if we have good internal controls in place, nobody wants to get caught. And if they know that they're being monitored and they know those things are out there, you're not only protecting the company, but you're actually protecting the individuals from themselves. And I know that that sounds, kind of mushy or whatever, but it's the truth, right? When we get in desperate situations, we get in fearful situations, even like with the pandemic today, we sometimes make illogical decisions. And I've seen good people, end up with a sick family member and they're desperate for money and they make a totally illogical decision to steal from their company, and or gambling problems, or those types of things. I mean, they just make desperate decisions. So if you have proper internal controls in place, that can help mitigate a lot of the fraud cases. So we're going to dig into workers' compensation. At CFMA, I actually didn't cover that. I was only speaking to construction professionals, and I was worried maybe that would be, some of the content would be a little sensitive, because I want to be clear, most companies and most people in the world are not committing crime, okay? So when you hear this stuff, I don't want you to think, one, that I'm pointing fingers at your company or you as a leader, because that you need to go back and eyeball all your employees and think that they're stealing from you, because that's just not the case. It's such a small percentage of the population that is actually committing crime and has a skewed moral compass. So these are more just to be aware of what's going on. But we'll cover workers' compensation. It's actually the most prevalent and the most expensive fraud that is going on in the construction industry. We'll talk about corruption. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that because that's a very deep subject. We'll talk about asset misappropriation, and we'll talk about billing schemes. And as we go into each section, if you have questions, like they said at the beginning, like Jillian and Lisa said, please just chime in with either a question or send a chat, because I'd rather just cover that question in that section so it's fresh for everybody. And I don't mind taking little breaks to cover that stuff. So, or you can ask your questions at the end. So before we get into those, the hot topic right now on everybody's mind is COVID. And everybody wants to know, is there anything new with COVID? Well, just like with any calamity, there are always opportunities for people who are seeking them, and people that have, again, maybe a skewed temporarily or permanently skewed moral compass, will look for ways to cut corners. And so with workers' compensation, what we're seeing now is a little bit of a trend towards some companies laying off their employees, but then, to save money, to save payroll taxes, and to save on workers' compensation, but then they still have these projects that they're picking up. And so what they're doing is they're technically laying their employees off, and then they're bringing them back as contractors, which we all know is not the way to go on a normal basis, and definitely not after AB 5 was passed. And so that's a kind of a thing to be aware of. If they do lay their employees off and then pick up projects, they've got to rehire them as W-2 employees. And to be honest, if they're hoping to get PPP funds, they don't want to lay people off anyway, because then they can't be forgiven, or a portion of their loan can't be forgiven. So definitely something to be aware of. The other thing is with the auto policies, similar scheme. If you take a company that has a fleet of vehicles, they may report to their insurance company that, hey, we're parking all our vehicles, so let's reduce our rates. But then they may give those vehicles out to the employees to drive around, or they might still be using them in the course of business. I was talking to a guy who said he was going to, he drives this vehicle for business, but he said he was going to drop it down to a personal policy, just because he's he's short on money right now, and he knows he can save some money on his policy by instead of having a commercial policy. The problem with that is if he's in the course of business and goes out and gets in a wreck, and you guys can all figure out the challenges that come with that. So, so those are the two things that I've kind of seen and heard about and read about. I'm not actively involved in any of those investigations, but I did talk to one of my friends at Department of Insurance, and they're seeing some of these cases come across their desk. Okay, so workers' compensation fraud really is broken down into two categories. The first being the employer and then the employee piece. So the most expensive and the least popular to talk about in the construction when I'm presenting to contractors or people associated contractors is the premium fraud piece. But again, I want to get back to the fact that most people are doing things right. Okay, so I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. Most people are doing things right. Premium fraud is very expensive and it's very detrimental to the market. So for those of you, I think probably 99% everybody on the call is familiar with it, but if you're not, premium fraud is kind of multifaceted, but it's simply underreporting. Either it's getting less of a premium charge for your insurance, for your workers' comp insurance policy through one of many schemes, right? It could be underreporting payroll or over-reporting what you're paying so that somebody appears to be a journeyman instead of an entry-level employee. It could be misclassification, where you're saying, you know, if you're a roofer, a roofing company, and you say you have 23 secretaries and one roofer, obviously you're going to save on workers' comp, but you're probably not really running a company that way and being effective. There's also people that just don't employ people, right? We just talked about that in the COVID situation where they're laying people off to avoid paying workers' compensation. This is a huge problem. According to NICB, we're talking about a $30 billion problem annually. And the reason that this causes, you know, if you've already beat me to it, I apologize, but the reason this causes problems in the market is if I'm a contractor who's doing things right, and I'm paying all my bills and I'm properly reporting my workers' compensation and paying all my payroll taxes, then my bids are naturally going to be more expensive, right? I've got to cover all my costs versus somebody who goes around and picks up contract workers illegally, pays them under the table, doesn't cover workers' compensation, all that stuff. They can charge lower rates and still be profitable. And people say, oh, well, what's the harm? Well, the harm is if an employee gets hurt, they're not covered, right? And there are ways to get them covered, but you know, essentially you're leaving this employee hanging out to dry. We had a case that I was a part of, a big search warrant in town. I won't say the name of the company, but it was a cleaning company, not a construction company. But what they did was they hired a lot of undocumented immigrants. And what they told them was, hey, if you want to be on payroll, you've got to have a social security card, which, you know, a lot of them didn't, obviously. But to give you more money and to save us money, well, they didn't say save us money, but to give you more money, we won't put you on payroll, we'll just pay you under the table. And so they had employed a significant amount of their workforce completely under the table. And obviously they could go out and they could bid on jobs much cheaper than a company that was doing legitimately. And this came to light because two of their workers got hurt. And one of them, when they went to the hospital, said, yes, this is a work-related expense or work-related injury. And then it came to our attention that this company didn't have workers' compensation insurance. So definitely something to be aware of and have an understanding of why that law is in place. But the one we think about with workers' compensation, probably most common, is the consumer piece or the employee piece, right? They filed a workers' comp injury and they're not legitimately injured. So we had a case, one of my partners had a case where this lady was claiming a back injury from work, and she had been off for a very long time. I can't remember if it was a year or getting close to a year, but when she would show up for her check-ins with the workers' compensation doctor, she was so hobbled that she had to be helped out of the car. She would come on a walker. This is a 38-year-old woman, I believe, who, appeared to be physically fit, but so hobbled she couldn't stand upright, leaning over her walker. And so I think the doctor actually kind of wrote a note to the insurance company that, hey, her physical condition doesn't, or her physical conditioning, right? The fact that she was in good physical condition, in good shape, didn't match up with how hobbled she was. And so we got the case. Again, it was one of my partners that worked the case. And I believe it was a social media post that kind of broke it, where this gal was posting about how she was going to be running in this marathon, but not just any marathon. So a marathon is 26.2 miles. That sounds awful in any accord, right? Well, I actually like to run, so that kind of sounds fun to me. But in a sick way, it is generally a tough, grueling thing, right? But she wasn't going to run any marathon. It was going to be this huge off-road trail run, going up 1,500 feet of elevation and all this stuff through the woods and on the coast. And so my teammate, my coworker, went out with several other investigators, and what they did was they hid along the course and pretended to be volunteers for the race, and they stood out there and took pictures of this lady running up the hill, and she was, tearing up the hill at full pace. So clearly not having the back injury that she claimed to have when she went to the doctor. In fact, the gal who investigated this case actually still has the picture above her cubicle. It's pretty funny. Any questions on the workers' compensation piece before I move on? I don't see any.
I'm not seeing any questions, but it's a good reminder that if any of the attendees have them, please share. Thank you.
All right, when we get to asset misappropriation, again, this is the one we think of probably the easiest, the simplest fraud to carry out. It is fraud because you're an employee. It's technically embezzlement if you take from the company. So getting back to my example with, well, you know what? I want to go back because I want to emphasize the fraud triangle just a bit. Workers' compensation fraud. Okay, if we get back to the fraud triangle and talk about the pressure, the opportunity, and the rationalization. Okay, the pressure with premium fraud is, hey, I've got to bring in money, which means I need to win bids. And there might be some extenuating circumstances, but it might just be running a regular business. The opportunity is, as you know, most people do self-reporting. Now there are audits of premium workers' comp premiums to ensure that the numbers are accurate, but it is oftentimes done a lot through self-reporting or through the payroll company. So there is an opportunity, and then the rationalization is everybody's doing it, or it's just a one-time thing so that I can get back on my feet and pay my bills, those types of things. So those are the rationalizations that happen with that. The workers' comp piece, the employee piece, again, the pressure could be, I hate my job, I have kids at home, I've got a sick relative I need to take care of, and I don't have time for this work thing. It could be, and then the opportunity is, well, I know other people have gone out on injury. I did slip down the stairs and everybody saw me slip down the stairs, so I can take advantage of that. And then the rationalization, could be anything from I'm deserving, everybody else does it. I did actually get hurt at work, so it's not like I'm totally lying, those types of things. There's got to be that rationalization piece. In the asset misappropriation piece, if we get back to my first story with Sue, The simple thefts are, stealing money from the petty cash fund, which she was doing. She also, I don't remember if she was actually selling supplies, but she would take some for personal use, that type of thing. But again, this could be subcontractors stealing from a contractor, could be employees stealing from their employer. It could be somebody external, either breaking in or just walking onto a site and taking supplies. The ghost employee piece is where I saw Sue take a lion's share of her money. If you're not familiar with the term, ghost employee just refers to paying somebody that doesn't actually work for the company, right? They're a ghost. Nobody's ever seen them because they don't exist or they don't actually work for the company. Ghost employees happen when, like in our situation that we investigated, where somebody has complete control over everything financial. And so Sue was in charge of payroll, cutting the checks, those types of things. And Mark, the owner, she had convinced him that, I hate having to call you to sign checks because then I have to bring you in out of the field and you might be an hour away. And so why don't we get you a signature stamp so I can just stamp the checks for you? And so that's what she did. This is back in 2006, I believe. So not everything was direct deposit, a lot of handwritten check, or not handwritten, but printed out checks in paper form. And so what she had done was put her cousin on payroll. Her cousin did not work for the company, and Mark, the owner, did not know that Sue's cousin was on payroll. And what she would do was Sue would cut herself a check, and it was obviously more than she was supposed to be paid. And then she would also cut her cousin a check. And the cousin and her had a split worked out where Sue would get some kickback from that check, and then the cousin would keep the rest. So it's extremely important with the ghost employees, prevent ghost employee strategies, to pay attention to your payroll roster, to have a master HR sheet of all your employees, and to make sure you know who you're paying. And then the other thing that she was doing was misusing company assets. So she had a company credit card. So she would use the company credit card to buy things personally. Like she would go to Costco. She had her car repaired. Some very expensive things. But what she would also do, so again, she's using the company credit card to charge the stuff, but then she would also submit it through payroll for reimbursement as if she had charged it on her personal card. So not only did the company pay for it, but then they paid her additionally for the same charge. So it got very expensive very quickly. And again, she made off with over $200,000 over the course of 2 years. Any questions before we move on to billing schemes?
No, that was good. I just appreciate your guidance on the controls in place to reduce that risk.
Yeah, we'll cover a little bit more in depth on that. I'm going to cruise through the corruption piece to make sure we have enough time to cover internal controls and answer questions on that. So one of the most prevalent things that I've seen in construction fraud is billing schemes. And probably the most common is change orders. So if you're not totally familiar with that process, usually there's a bid for jobs and it details out exactly what will be done with what materials and that type of thing. And then if the owner of the building decides, well, I actually want brass fixtures instead of, steel fixtures or whatever. I don't know. I don't know enough about the ins and outs of that side, but there can be a change order, right? And those are common. They're common in any project. They're common if you build a house or have a bathroom remodeled. I just had mine remodeled and we had a change order because we decided to change the tile and that was more expensive. So they're not necessarily fraudulent or nefarious. but they are an opportunity. If we get back to the fraud triangle, they are an opportunity to push things for a bigger profit. And Lisa, I see that I have a question. You want me to go back to that now?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, did you determine what Sue's rationalization was for her theft from Mark?
Yes. So she decided I think she was in her mid to late 30s, that she was going to be leaving her husband and wanted to start living this very extravagant, Real Housewives of Beverly Hills kind of lifestyle on a $13 an hour job. And that $13 an hour was getting in the way of her trips to Vegas and the plastic surgeries that she wanted, and those types of things. So that was her. I don't know what ultimately led to that break in her consciousness, but she was funding this very expensive, very extravagant lifestyle for, basically for her Facebook, and so she could show off that she was traveling everywhere.
Wow, thank you.
Sure. So again, in the billing schemes piece, you're looking for accurate change orders. So I had a case that kind of took on 2 or 3 of these bullet points here, and I won't say which side I was working on, either the business owner, the building owner, or the construction company. But essentially what happened was the building owner contracted with this construction company for a very large building, several $million-dollar project. And the owner didn't check on his building. He figured he hired a good contractor. So he's cutting checks, he's getting progress billings, he's getting change orders. He says, okay, yeah, he signs off on everything. And pretty soon he gets to about 85, 90% of the budget. And he goes, man, I'm curious. I want to see my building. I bet it's almost done. I bet they're just putting the finishing touches on the inside if we're 85, 90% done. So he drives out there and he finds the building to be about 30% completed. And, the windows aren't in, the doors aren't in. I mean, you can just walk right into this construction site, and none of the stuff, the expensive materials that he had ordered were installed, those types of things. So whether that was fraud or bad management was the big question in this case. The building owner obviously felt like the contractor was defrauding them, and the construction company, the contractor, felt like the owner had changed the project so much that that's what drove change orders, and ultimately led to this cost overrun, and that's why they were so far behind. And what I found, it hasn't been fully litigated, so I can't totally disclose everything, but what I found on my end is it was kind of a combination of both. The owner had, in fact, made a lot of changes, ordered things from out of the country that had to be custom fitted electrically and those types of things. But the construction company probably was stretching some of their change orders and deviating a little bit from the use of materials. So those are the kinds of things we'd see. The substitution of materials piece is just when you're a building owner and you hire somebody for a contract or a project, you come to an agreement as to what materials you're going to use, and if they're, let's say, a premium grade material, you're expecting to have that in your building when it's done. And what I've seen happen is that nefarious contractors, again, to make more money, to save money on costs, will use substandard materials and hope that they get that through the inspection. And the way to protect against that is to truly do your due diligence on a project, make sure that you have somebody that's qualified to help with the inspection, the final inspection, and the sign-offs, and make sure that you're getting truly what you paid for. All right. Any questions on that piece?
Clint, we had a question come through on workers' compensation. In your experience, the question is, what if the employer believes it is fraudulent or perhaps inflated in that way, but the insurer is asking to, let's just settle it because it's cheaper than fighting it? Have you worked with that type of workers' comp fraud? Would you have any suggestions for our attendee?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because if you think about most of business, right, is trying to minimize damage, right? It's risk management, and we saw that a lot, right, where the insurance company isn't going to put together, and not to any fault of theirs, really. If you think about it from a business perspective, they're not going to put together a $50,000 or $100,000 case, lawyers and experts and that type of thing to fight a $5,000 or $10,000 case, right? Like all of us that have principles just cringe when we hear that, right? We go, oh my gosh, no, why would you do that? Just do it for the principle. But you can't run a business successfully if you fight every $10,000 case, right? The insurance companies wouldn't exist, or their premiums would be so high that none of us could afford it. What I recommend in that situation is, definitely let the insurance company know, and what will happen is the insurance company will flag it, and those flagged cases get reported to NICB and reported to the Department of Insurance. The other thing that you can do is call the Department of Insurance directly and file either on the hotline, or I think you can actually do it online now. I'm not sure if they updated that, but you call in and you can actually report it. And this is whether it's an employer, it could be your neighbor, right? You could be reporting your neighbor that is out on workers' compensation, and he's out, building a play structure for his kids or whatever. But you can report it directly to the Department of Insurance. In fact, some of our best leads came directly from employers because they were faced with that situation. And the Department of Insurance, that's what they exist for. They have the resources. It is a government agency funded by insurance premiums for this purpose. And so, and if it's deemed to be fraud, then the insurance company gets restitution, which then would lower the employer's rating because they wouldn't have a claim on their file. They would go back and retroactively remove that finding on there. The other thing to note, and I guess it's a bit of a shaming law, but the other thing to note on on workers' compensation is if somebody's convicted of workers' compensation, either of workers' compensation fraud, either on the employer side or the employee side, there's a law that states that the Department of Insurance posts their name and their conviction information on their website. So, if you ever want to read about the types of things that are going on in that world, that's a good place to find it. Okay, so let's, I'm going to cruise through corruption. You guys are going to get a copy of the slides. I believe Lisa and Jillian were going to make these available to you. If you ever have any questions down the road, you can reach out to me. But corruption is your bribes, your kickbacks, your illegal gratuities, extortion, and conflicts of interest. There's a case that, oh, there we go. So there's a case in Detroit. Kwame Kilpatrick was the youngest mayor in Detroit. And if you want to know like what this tangibly looks like, I encourage you to just Google him and read about what he carried out. I was going to go into that, but I know we're short on time and I want to spend more time in the internal controls piece and answer your questions around that. But definitely, again, it can be the most expensive and the most damaging thing is corruption. All right, so how do we protect ourselves against this? Before I do that, are there any questions about any of the schemes that we've covered?
There's an interest in the work comp convictions posting link online. If you wouldn't mind sending that to us after the meeting, we can get that out to the attendees.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know,
Thanks.
I can't remember the amount of detail because internally I would see all the detail. I don't remember what they actually post online, but yeah, I'll definitely get that to you. Okay, so we talked about proper internal controls at the beginning, where where 50% of cases, fraud cases, were due to lack of internal control. So that's the third one down. I'll let you guys read these slides. I'm just going to touch on probably the four biggest ones, the most important ones that you can put in place today, or start working on immediately. And the biggest one is internal controls, as far as a functional, practical, on paper way of doing things. And sometimes it's easy to do. If you have enough employees, you can segregate duties really well. If you have a very small company, sometimes that means getting creative with things. And so there was a company that I was working with that had somebody take some money from they were getting checks in the mail and cash in the mail, which you're not supposed to send, by the way, but they were getting cash in the mail, and this employee was taking it. And so I went to the small company to help them out, and they said, well, we don't have 3 people in the accounting department to segregate control, so what do we do? And I said, look, you've got 1 person in the accounting department, you've got to pull somebody from outside to come in and do the mail. That's just, you've got to use resources where you have them. So it's getting creative and employing those resources and bringing in an expert to help with that. The other thing, this surprised me and probably will surprise a lot of you because it sounds old and ancient, is this idea of a hotline, especially with big projects, but really in any company. ACFE estimates that about 42% of cases are caught because of a hotline. So that could be a tip line that somebody actually calls, an 800 number or something like that, or it could be a place you have on your website where honest, ethical employees can report unethical or dangerous behavior, right? It could be your OSHA complaints. It could be, hey, I saw, Johnny walk off with a shovel the other day, those types of things. But just having that anonymous tip line allows ethical people to feel like they have some say to help their company without getting themselves in hot water with their fellow coworkers. So that's a huge one. The other big one, which I don't have on here, is your hiring practices. And that is absolutely integral in a successful framework. A lot of us, when we get ready to hire, we can be in a rush to do it, right? We need to fill positions, those types of things. Take your time, get to know people, make sure you call references, make sure that you do all your due diligence, maybe even have 2 or 3 interviews, maybe one of them is just a casual coffee or something like that, but truly get to know them. Like I talked about at the beginning, you don't hire people you don't trust, right? So the more you're around somebody, the better the chance is that you're going to pick up on something that's either, just not right, or you're going to get that deeper sense of comfort to know that this is definitely somebody I want in my organization. But by far, the most effective control that you can put in place for your company or your clients is leadership, and that's the setting the tone at the top. John Maxwell says, a leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And if you think about companies that you've worked at, I know I've worked at a few where the manager or the leader, I was probably never close enough to the CEO, but where I watched my manager, push up their expense report a little bit, or take us out to lunch even though they weren't supposed to, or use company time and company resources to go out and buy things. The problem with that example is the manager or the leader's lens of what is right and wrong might be different than the people that they're leading. And if I'm an employee and I'm watching my leader, my leader stretch the truth for their personal benefit, I might think, well, if he's charging an extra $100 on his expense report, it's probably okay for me to charge $500 extra on my expense report. So I know that sounds, a little cliche with this tone at the top piece, but it is absolutely true. If you set the tone, whether you're the CEO, you're an employee, you're the lowest rung employee, or you're a leader somewhere in the organization, what you do and the example you set will carry so much weight as to what's acceptable in your culture and what's not acceptable in your culture. It won't always defend against fraud and crime, but it will go a long ways to setting the ethics standard within your organization. And I think I am out of time unless there are any other questions.
Clint, that's great. Thank you. As you're talking about the leader setting the tone and how important it is, because they may stretch a little and then employees may see that and take advantage to stretch more. It reminded me of something an old mentor said, which is, heavy is the head which wears the crown. There is definitely a higher level of responsibility that a leader has to accept to lead well. So thank you for leading us through that presentation. I don't see any questions immediately in the question box or chat. I'll look for another minute on that. But I did want to make sure that everybody knows that they can see your contact information there. They can connect with you via email, your phone, LinkedIn. They can listen to your podcast. I'm going to go back and listen to the one you'd mentioned of Michelle, but I also really enjoyed Brittany. So thank you for making those available. As I look for any final questions, I also wanted to invite people to send questions to our agency if that is anything they wanted to follow up with us on, or to their broker or account manager if it's specific to their situation. And then I also wanted to invite all of our attendees first to say thank you for joining us today for this construction and workers' comp fraud webinar, and to invite you to next Thursday, May 28th at 10:30. We are having another BenderU, Get a Grip on Your Business and Get the Results You Want, with Sherry Neesham, and she has the Entrepreneurial Operating System, or EOS, that she'll be speaking and leading us through. It's a tremendous presentation. We encourage at least 2 people from every company to attend, so they can then talk through how they may want to implement this within their organization. So not seeing any final questions, but we will get a copy of this recording out to the attendees, along with the link to the workers' comp convictions posting. So Clint, thank you very much for sharing your time and your stories and your knowledge with us this morning. I really appreciate it. And attendees, thank you all for joining us this morning. Appreciate your time. Continue building great projects and managing well.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.